A lot of people in the chat room tonight asking, are these real? Yes, they are real. These are not reenactments. These are actual, real, and they're very old recordings from a group of Italian brothers who exposed them after the Soviet Union fell. They couldn't keep it a secret any longer. They had monitored these astronauts and cosmonauts going into space, and this is what we got. The only thing that we see is these astronauts and the sounds they're having. My guest tonight, Doug Dietrich. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people wondering if these are real. They're very real, aren't they, Doug?
You bet. And it's important to remember, I certainly want to leave time so that we can hear more if we have more.
We do.
Yeah, definitely we'll get into that. But I do want to emphasize the fact that, again, some of the history behind it was this kind of military kind of competition to the lethal level went on between the United States and the Soviet Union beginning back on June 20th, 1937, when a Soviet AN-T-25, an AN-25, successfully made a transpolar flight from Moscow to Vancouver. And the pilot was Valery Chkhalov, and you can spell his name Chkalov, and you can look him up. He was celebrated as an aerospatial pioneer, and he flying over Alaskan American territory to complete that flight gave the Americans such a shock because they had no coordinated private aerospace industry and Air Force at the time. They simply had an Army Air Corps. That's what led to the formation in response to that threat of ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, in World War II, has a far longer history of black ops than people realize. And that's ARPA, of course, is what produced the Internet that then ultimately released it to the public a couple of decades after DARPA designed it. DARPA was, the D was added later to put defense in front of ARPA. At the end of the Japanese-American War, because one of the things was the Japanese said, well, we'll get rid of an army in our Constitution, even though they still have one, and the Americans said, well, we'll get rid of a Department of War, and what they have now is a Department of Defense, so the defense was added later. But, you know, this led to the kind of competition and lethality that we're going to hear on these tapes. What we're hearing is the continuity of that war that began a long time ago.
Definitely so. Let's go to a phone call right now. We're going to go to Scott calling in today from Milwaukee. Hi, Scott, you're on Ground Zero. Thanks for waiting.
Oh. Yeah, I was wondering. I had a friend who said that he knew of one of these X-1, you know, the experimental jets. They dropped them off the B-52s, you know, like Steve Austin, $6 Million Man.
Yes.
But one of them just went up and disappeared. Presumably the first guy to die in space. They never found anything of it.
That's entirely conceivable because those are essentially just piloted rockets, and the idea of one of them losing control and going up instead of on a more predictable flight pattern, since they're basically just glorified suicide bombs, that doesn't strike me as anything that's, you know, but it's an example of a death of a pilot and essentially a test pilot. And test pilots do have high death rates, so in a sense you could consider him unwilling and unwitting astronaut who died in that regard.
Yeah, I could never find anything about it. In fact, I never really thought about it. He mentioned it right after the Atlantis blew up.
Wow. Yeah, these things leak.
You know, and just tonight, suddenly that, you know, struck the memory. I'm just like, well, what about this guy, you know, who died?
Well, you know, a lot of people died. Like, for instance, there was a pilot who was actually quite famous, and he at the time, and I can't remember his name to save my soul right now, but he died flying the American kamikaze. The Americans actually contracted a kamikaze at the end of the war because they finally realized they really lacked a homeland defense, and the several pilots died testing that to prove its workability as a suicide craft. So test pilots die, and when they die, nobody hears about it. You can look them up if you're an aviation researcher, and sometimes you find them, sometimes you don't. And this, sadly, is one of those cases. We will never know the names of these cosmonauts that we're hearing of right now as we hear their death throes.
Yeah, I guess what they figured was he got so high up there wasn't enough atmosphere to steer, and he just kept going up because he couldn't turn and go back down.
Right.
So he's up there. He's up there somewhere along with all the other astronauts that had died.
That's right, in the detritosphere. And you may see a much more aggressive Japanese space program trying to clear that detritosphere if a large part of Japan becomes uninhabitable.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you would see a much more aggressive Japanese space program. That would make logical sense. That would
After the disaster in Sendai?
Because of Fukushima, if there's enough radiation that does threaten future generations where just some parts of Japan that held a good part of their population become uninhabitable, a very aggressive space program to colonize the moon would be a logical response.
Wow, I didn't even thought about that. Thank you, Scott, for your call.
Hey, and thanks for you. I like your show.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Very interesting stuff. We're going to talk more with Doug about that. I'm sure a lot of listeners didn't even know that we were going to go in that direction either. An aggressive space program if Japan becomes uninhabitable. That's an interesting prospect. A way to get out of the cradle of civilization somewhere out in space. A colony. Perhaps that's the only answer to escape the devastation. What are your thoughts? 503-417-7575 or 1-800-827-0750. Has this show changed your mind about the space program?